it's a great pleasure and also honor to be here tonight and have this conversation with Philip Kitcher. So the topic of moral progress seems to have gained some momentum. And I think this must also be related to the publication of Philip's new book, because I've received a number of invitations to events, workshops, conferences, and they're all somehow related to this book. And yeah, Philip, we could have almost met in Zurich, I think, this week for a workshop. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it because I have two conferences here in the Netherlands about the ethics of technology. And yeah, philosophy and ethics of technology is the field that I'm currently mainly working in. Yeah, but I think we will both be present at a workshop in Rome at the beginning of December, at least virtually we will meet there. And so we can continue our conversation, which is really nice. Yeah, so let me start perhaps with trying to summarize what I take to be some of the central points of the book. And then afterwards, I will ask you, Philip, to correct me and also to add things that you would like to highlight. And this is, of course, in particular for those listeners who are not so familiar with your work and who haven't read the book, which has only just been published very short time ago. So in these Munich lectures that are published in this book, you are attempting to further advance the Deweyan project of making progress, moral progress, more systematic and more sure-footed. And this by gaining a better understanding of what moral progress is. And you look at three historical examples, paradigm examples of moral progress. They are the probably most often cited examples in the literature on this topic, namely the abolition of slavery, the expansion of opportunities for women, and the acceptance of loving relationships between people of the same sex. The alternative or the novel account of moral progress that you are advancing in these lectures constitute an alternative to the discovery view of moral progress, which is the view that moral progress consists in discovering moral truth, understood in a realist sense as mind independent. And I must say, I'm very sympathetic to your rejection of this realist view of moral progress. So on your alternative view, individuals and societies make moral progress as they amend their moral practices to overcome the problems that beset them. It is a non-teleological understanding of moral progress. This pragmatic notion of progress consists in solving problems and in overcoming limitations. And the three examples that you discuss are examples of very slow processes of change, of progress. And you believe that had the agents at that time in those processes applied the methodology that you are advancing here, like the preliminary methodology for making more progress, then these processes could have been faster and they could have been more thorough. This is what you believe. So that is, I think, one of the really crucial things of your proposal, that you are coming with a methodology for achieving more progress in a more systematic way in practice. It's a methodology that is preliminary. You emphasize that. It has to be further developed in the course of moral inquiry. It's nothing fixed, nothing final. It's the first start, and you hope that it will be taken up and it will evolve in the right direction. It is directed towards practice. It's not a method for theory, but a method for practice. This is something that I find very appealing. And it is a methodology for identifying morally problematic situations, and then for giving direction to the process of moral inquiry and the solutions that are to be found and implemented in this process. So the two things that I find most interesting, most intriguing in your account are, on the one hand, this idea that we need a methodology for the practice, methodology that we can follow, and which and this hopefulness that speaks out of that as well. So you are hopeful that humans who have already made some more progress in the past are able to progress further, and should definitely try, because it's not hopeless. Is there anything that you would like to correct at this point? Is there anything that you would really like to add that's really central to your view?
So Thank you very much, Julia. I mean, it's an excellent, excellent summary of what I say in the book. I would just like to say one thing about one of the examples. It does seem to me remarkable that the third of my examples, the acceptance of loving relationships among members of the same sex, has gone much faster than the other two. I've seen it happen in my lifetime, and that couldn't be said of either of the other two. They were very, very much longer term. I don't know what's responsible for that, but I think it's an interesting question to ask why this particular case was faster and smoother. The other thing I want to say is there's a sense in which the whole point of the book is to reorient a certain kind of way of approaching ethics. So it seems to me, and I'll be completely sort of all over the place on this, completely open about it. It seems to me that the impulse to do moral philosophy actually comes from what I think of as the reforming venture, the attempt to make people's lives go better, to make people's conduct better, and to make our institutions go better. And I think the turn to thinking about the character of morality, what moral statements mean, whether or not they're true, all of the kinds of things that are presupposed in what I call the discovery view, is itself an attempt that was perfectly well motivated, I think, when it began. If you know more about what morality is as an institution, then maybe you can do these reforms better. But it hasn't turned out that way. And so I think the discovery view is not only, I think, inadequate, it's also been incredibly unhelpful in the enterprise that originally motivated it. If we know more about morality, we thought, then maybe we can reform our practices more smoothly. Well, the versions of moral realism on offer, that it seems to me, are just so inept methodologically that we should just look in a different direction. So I want to turn meta-ethical thinking in a different direction. I want to say, just give up these realism disputes. They're going nowhere. But instead, focus on moral methodology and do what methodologists in other areas do, namely build on your successes, look at the failures, and try to formulate ways of going on with moral inquiry, as with scientific inquiry, as with social scientific inquiry, as with other inquiries in the humanities, by trying to see what has worked and what has failed. And that's really the strategy of the book. One thing that attracts me about this is the thought that there isn't some sort of final morality waiting out there for us. There's a kind of pluralist tendency behind what I'm saying, which is that as we go, we can create better and better worlds, but there's, as it were, no fixed end point. There's nothing in relation to which a perfect world that we have to compare ourselves with. It's rather that things get better through overcoming problems and limitations. And I thought you actually captured that very nicely. But I wanted to say it in this way because it suggests there's a certain kind of open-endedness to the moral project as I conceive it. It's not, as it were, tied to some fixed and final goal. It's a matter of improving on the state that came before. So that's the way I think about moral progress. And for me, the opportunity to give these lectures was really a terrific opportunity, and I really wanted to talk about this. I should say, one of my commentators, Amir Srinivasan, in a review of an earlier book that I wrote called The Ethical Project, it sort of inspired me to go in this direction, because she, after recording, as philosophers do, various disagreements with things that I'd said, she said, but at the end of the day, maybe there's something, there's a sort of method that comes out of this that might be worth, doing whatever your other philosophical inclinations are. And that got me started thinking in this direction. So I owe Amir a rather large debt there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I also read your earlier book, The Ethical Project, and there already I really was really fascinated by how you turn things around. Now you say the notion of moral progress comes first. So
Yeah.
that is primary and truth is only secondary.
Yeah.
So really you need to, if you are so used to the traditional debates between realists, anti-realists, you really need to think hard to understand this. Yeah, but then it makes a lot of sense, and it seems indeed much more promising. So thanks a lot for adding these things and formulating it in a slightly different way to make clear where you're coming from and what the direction is, and also for emphasizing this open-endedness of the moral project. Also interesting that you called your earlier book The Ethical Project, but now in the new book you also emphasize that there are actually two projects. And the moral project is primary. The ethical project, comes later. Also,
that's right. Historically right? Primary, yeah. Because I think people started engaging in moral and ethical life by asking about the ways they should act, and especially the ways they should act towards one another. I think that's where it all starts, and it's only later, probably considerably later in our evolutionary history, when people have, as it were, enough varieties of life to choose among, that they can start to think about, well, what kind of person do I want to be? Which is really the ethical question. I mean, for me, I think I'm in line with what Bernard Williams said a long time ago about this, that morality is about, what should I do? And ethics is about what kind of person should I try to become? And in a sense, ethics is the broader project because, the kind of person I should become is somebody who actually acts in the right ways. So, but it's the moral project that comes first historically, I think. And then at a certain stage, probably 20,000 years ago, something like that, people began to ask themselves questions about what kinds of lives they should live. And I think it's no accident, probably, that from that time, you get a kind of distinction among members of a human population in which people are obviously distinguished for the things they do. And those then go forward into the great myths of the ancient world, the great heroes and the patterns of behavior. So it's that's the way I'm currently thinking about it.
Yes, thank you. May I also ask you to tell us or try to briefly explain, especially again for those who are not familiar with this work, the core of the methodology that you are proposing, this democratic contractualism, as you call it.
Yeah. So one thing that I very much oppose, and I probably am going to continue opposing, and some people really don't like this, is the idea that moral insight is the property of individuals, right? So it's, some people think about this in religious terms. It's those who are close to God, the prophets, those who are especially enlightened, the saints, and so forth, who can achieve moral insight. Some people think of it in terms of wisdom, people who are especially wise. And some people think of it as the province of philosophers. Philosophers really can figure this out. I actually don't think that's true. I think philosophers are midwives to moral progress. We try to help things along, but actually the ultimate source of authority is collective. That we make the core of my methodology for moral progress is the idea that listening to one another is incredibly important. And so it's a matter of opening your mind and opening your ears and opening your heart to people who are suffering and to seeing whether those sufferings are in the end justifiable or whether they're justified in making the complaints. And if they are justified in making the complaints, trying to do something about them. And that solution has to be collective. So the open-endedness of morality comes from the fact that we must work this out as we go along. I mean, there's a sense in which this is very much in the spirit of a particular approach to the philosophy of science. I mean, I was profoundly influenced by Thomas Kuhn's work on the structure of scientific revolutions, where he said, let's stop talking about science in this terribly abstract way. Let's look at what goes on in history. Let's look at what goes on at those moments when it seems great advances are made. And let's try to tailor our accounts of scientific methodology and of scientific progress to accommodate that. And this is, I think, of what I'm doing as a kind of Kuhnian turn in metaethics. And I suspect it will be greeted with the same kind of condemnation, but that's perfectly okay. But it seems to me right to think about it this way, to think about it as a process that has a history, but no absolutely definite future, that has to be worked out by individuals, not on their own, through exercising deep moral insight, but through responding to one another. I mean, in a certain sense, it's so absolutely, sillily straightforward. I mean, it seems to me, in a certain sense, terribly obvious once you've said it. And it is, of course, the way that the people who are closest to our prehistoric ancestors who invented morality in the first place actually behave. They sit down at the end of the day in what Hume famously called the cool hour and talk over their difficulties. It's interesting that Amir's review of my book, which got me started in this direction, was called In the Long Cool Hour. Yeah. And that's exactly right. I mean, it's I think she put her finger on something very important.
Yeah.
Or the editor did, perhaps.
I would like to ask you about what this can mean in the present. So when we think about perhaps the most urgent moral problem that we face today, namely like the challenge of global warming, which we might want to call a global problem, because it seems that only jointly humanity is able to deal with this, if at all. I'm wondering, what can it mean to engage in the kind of ideal conversation that you are envisaging? Because in principle, not only everyone living on this planet today, but even future generations that are not yet alive, I mean, will be affected, are affected, will be affected. So they all would need to be included. Could you say a little bit about what kind of, how we can go about?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it seems to me this is a very good case for my views about this. I do think that as with the unborn, as with the developmentally disabled, as with the aged and infirm who cannot speak for themselves, as with non-human animals, future generations can be represented in this conversation, but they must be represented by other people. And so I do think that we can stage a kind of conversation. But to my mind, and I've argued this in a book I wrote a few years ago with Evelyn Fox Keller about the climate change issue, Evelyn and I both think that the answer to this has to be a kind of grassroots democratic discussion. And it has to involve people of different perspectives and people with different predicaments and different needs. I mean, what the resistance to climate change is not felt so much among the young. Of course, there's a good reason for that. Young people look into the future, they see what's going to happen, what's going to beset them and their children and their grandchildren, and they want the world to be a habitable place for those people who come after them. And their second point, they are not yet invested in society in a way that those who are, say, 50 or 60 are. And those people are frightened by the thought of climate action. They feel that they are unprotected, that their lives will be turned upside down. And so they resist. And that worry has to be responded to. So too does the worry of those people in nations that are yearning for electrification and who look at the record of emissions, which is extraordinary. I mean, the United States, for example, has used up far, far more of its, as it were, carbon allowance in the sky than any other country. So all of that has gone to make these countries immensely wealthy and immensely powerful. And the developing nations look at this and they say, why should you deprive us of the opportunity for the kinds of technological advances you've enjoyed. And that's also a point of view that needs to be represented. And finally, there are those people who think that unless we're very careful about all of this, we're going to lose vast numbers of achievements from the past. All of the great cultural things that have been developed, all of the great social and political institutions that have been developed are going to be swept away. So it seems to me that we urgently need this kind of conversation, and it must grow. It must grow from conversations among people of these different types at a small level, and then it must expand like a snowball. And I'm very encouraged by seeing what has happened, for example, in France, by Macron's attempts to start this kind of conversation. I'm very encouraged by the fact that some of these kinds of conversations, for example, in Ireland about abortion issues, have turned out to go surprisingly well. I think it can be done. It will always be imperfect. The conditions I put on this kind of deliberation, which are the conditions of inclusiveness, that is, all the relevant perspectives have to be represented in the conversation. A condition of good information, and of course that's also itself these days a matter of debate. These people have to be well informed, they have to be open-minded, but above all, I think the condition that is most important and the condition that seems so often missing in our deliberations is a willingness to enter into the lives of others, to understand the world from their point of view, and to try to find a solution that will satisfy all the participants. That seems to me an incredibly important feature. And we're never going to have that kind of perfect conversation, but we can keep trying to improve it. And I think we can keep trying to improve it if there are public norms that are recognized and acknowledged for participating in these kinds of deliberations, and if young people are brought up engaging in these kinds of deliberations. So I have another book that will appear in a couple of months' time about education. And this is a large part of it, how you actually get people to become really good citizens, not only of their nation, but also of the world. Because as you pointed out, this has got to be a cross-national, transnational conversation. So I think it can be done. I think we have to do it quickly. I think Macron's efforts are a good beginning, and I think we should be trying to build on them as rapidly as possible.
Yeah, and I assume that you are thinking of conversations at different levels, so at the more local levels, national, regional.
Well, I think you need groups. Macron organized groups all over France, and what you need are groups all over each country, and then you start. Then they have to start exchanging with one another.
Exactly. So this has to build up. Yeah, I understand. Thank you. I have another theme that I would like to discuss with you, which is related, or I will relate it, and that is about the role of technologies in morally progressive developments. Of course, interestingly, already in the ethical project, you describe or understand morality as a social technology, right? It's a technology itself. But I'm wondering, because for the rest, you are not saying a lot about technology. You do mention a deep question that had been posed to you by John McFarlane.
Yes.
Was about the role of technologies in your examples. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that, what you think the role of technology is regarding the examples you discussed, but also with an eye on the future, and perhaps also when wondering to what extent technology can actually help to create conditions under which this moral inquiry and conversation is even easier, in a way, facilitated by technology.
The last part of the question I don't think I can answer. I mean, it seems to me a very good possibility that technology can do that. I mean, John McFarlane pointed out to me that certain kinds of decisions about women's roles in the workplace, say, were made much easier by technological advances, e.g., the arrival of methods of birth control. So that's a very good point. technology changes the space in which these deliberations go forward and can suddenly open the door, make a solution seem possible that wasn't possible before. So I think that's truly an important point. What I've been thinking about recently is not trying to predict those kinds of technologies, but actually looking at what I call institutional friction, the ways in which moral progress is retarded by having domains of human life make what seems to be moral progress from their own, as it were, individual points of view, or make progress from their individual points of view, that then get in one another's way. So, I mean, the most obvious examples of this center on the ways in which economics is taken to constrain various things. So economists will say, well, there's fantastic progress that we have made by doing X, Y, and Z. But one wants to say the effects on certain other domains, say on the environment or on the ways in which children are taught, or on the ways in which political life goes, or on the kinds of choices that we get faced with and the kinds of ethical lives we can live, may be severely detrimental. And so I think, one of the great roles of philosophy, it seems to me, is to try to understand these kinds of relationships and how they develop, to understand the problem of institutional friction. Now, Anthony said something, and I think you echoed it, which I think is very important. And that is that even when we seem to be making moral progress, it can become impermanent, it can collapse, it can fail to be completed. And that comes about, I think, because of these kinds of frictions. And so there has to be another part of the methodology, which I'm not at the moment confident that I know how to describe, which really responds to this kind of thing. Now, you were talking more about a positive role for technology, and I think that's also right to appreciate. And I think if we had a clearer sense, of where in these discussions it was difficult to make any kind of advance, to go forward with the discussions, then we might see more clearly how technology could adapt and help us along. Not by giving us, faster washing machines or anything like that, but actually, as it were, resolving a dilemma that arises in the course of these kinds of deliberations. That's the best I can do with the positive part of your question. But it's a very, very, very good question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was also very intrigued by Rahel Yegi's comments on your lectures. And I think you already now also referred a little bit to that when you talked about the institutional friction. That's something I think she also emphasizes. And in your response to her in the book, you claim that human beings, aided by probing analyses of social structures, can anticipate the problems and accelerate progress. So that goes against an attitude where you think, okay, if the time is not yet ripe for more progress, then we just have to wait. We cannot do anything about it. So there is this belief, conviction of yours that it is possible. And I was just wondering, it seems to me that this anticipatory aspect is very important, and that this also underlines how important imagination is. And how important it also is for education to stimulate that moral imagination, and perhaps even what some have called techno-moral imagination, where you try to envisage scenarios where technology and morality interact, and you can sort of think of how new technological developments can affect our moral frameworks, our concepts, our norms. And I wanted to just very briefly tell you about some of the work I'm doing at the moment and ask what you think about in relation to your account of moral progress. So Anthony mentioned in the beginning that I'm currently working on how new and emerging technologies affect fundamental concepts, in particular related to the human condition. And one of the technologies we are currently working on is the artificial womb. So I don't know if you heard about it, but in Eindhoven, in the Netherlands, scientists are working on the first prototype of an artificial womb that is supposed to revolutionize prenatal intensive care, neonatal intensive care. So something that can solve the problems with current incubators, because it's really very much like the maternal womb. And so we are wondering what this will mean in the future, what that could mean for gender roles, for understanding of parenthood, the beginning of life. There's a lot of issues, and some philosophers, especially feminist philosophers, celebrate this already as like a further liberation of women. So in that sense, it can be seen as a continuation of the process that has already happened and the progress we already have achieved with regard to the equality between men and women. But so you could, in a way, say that by developing these kind of technologies, you are also engaging in social experimentation. And you're emphasizing that also in your account, right? That we need experimentation. Of course, that will also perhaps have negative effects, but some experimentation is needed to sort of get at what the consequences also of certain developments are. So I'm wondering what the role of technology can be in these kinds of social experimentations, and what is desirable here and what not. So do you have any ideas on that?
So there's so much in what you've just said. I feel that anything I could say is bound to be inadequate. But let me just say one thing. I had lunch with Rahel Yegi last Friday, actually. We talked about where we're currently going with our projects. And there's been this tremendous convergence between the two of us in recent years. And what we discovered was that there's been even more since we met in Munich and this conversation began. And Rahel, like me, is very, very interested in the ways in which different domains of life rub up against one another. She liked my term institutional friction. It has both a positive and a negative, sort of connotation. Positive because without friction, it'd be very difficult to walk along, and negative because friction can really, slow things down, get in the way of things. So I think that, I think there's more and more convergence. I think I am becoming much more sensitive to something that Rahel sees very, very clearly, which is the ways in which there are these incredibly embedded structures that get in the way of individual attempts. To a rough approximation, the tradition of which Rahel comes out of is profoundly social. Tradition of which I come out of is profoundly individualistic. And it's constantly an effort we're not really an effort anymore, but, I'm constantly aware of how inadequate my sense of the social is compared to hers. So this systematic exploration of the conditions under which people live seems to me very important. Now, what you just said about experimentation seems to me just absolutely right. When we come to a stage at which certain kinds of people want to start living in a new and different way, conservatives will always say, but look, this could go horribly wrong. And they're right. Nobody can predict that. But I think the right answer was given by Mill and Harriet Taylor back in the 19th century. But basically they said, look, if people are clamoring to do this, and if they enter into these experiments voluntarily, you should let them try, because we'll never know unless we try. And that seems to me exactly the right attitude. So I think we don't know in advance what artificial wombs are going to do for human society, for human social relations, for the liberation or the confinement of women. But we should allow for experiments so long as the people who enter into them know clearly what they're doing and really are interested in doing those experiments. We cannot, of course, treat societies or parts of societies as sort of just guinea pigs, just shove them in. But given that there is an impulse here to try to explore these possibilities, I think we should let it go ahead. And we should constantly be having these conversations around it in which people of various kinds come together and appraise what's been going on. So I do think that technology can contribute enormously to further moral progress. But it's got to be through the kinds of collective appraisals, the collective scrutiny, and the collective deliberations that are, I think, fundamental to my methodology. Look, there's a lot. I mean, you said quite rightly that I say in the book, and I'm completely sincere about this. This is just the beginning of an enterprise, and we should remind ourselves of what scientists of the early 17th century did. Their proposals were pretty crude, and they were vaguely inconsistent, et cetera, et cetera. But out of that, out of trying to apply them, something better came. And I see the methodological enterprise in which I'm engaged in those terms.
Yeah.
I can't claim the same stature as they had. But on the other hand, I do think that we get this started and we keep going and we try to refine our methodologies as we go. And as we get more technological innovations, as we understand more about what these things are going, it will be possible, I think, to give more detailed answers to your question, which is, how do we do this?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We just start off doing some of it.
Yeah.
We examine it. We see what happens. We build on that,
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Now we have to open the discussion to the audience. There are a number of questions written in the chat. And I think Anthony already selected them a little bit. So I would just start posing some questions to you, Philip.
Absolutely.
So the first question is about the criteria for identifying what works. So B. Meekham asks, what are the criteria for identifying what works? How do we identify or choose the criteria?
Okay, it's a very good question, but what I'm going to suggest is that that's what these collective deliberations are supposed to do. They are supposed to look at the outcome of a process, or if you like, at the status of a complaint from a number of different perspectives, representing, the people who are initially dissatisfied and the people who are initially, perfectly satisfied with what's happening. And they're going to try to find a way of reaching something that everybody can tolerate. And the fundamental criterion for something's working is going to be this, that if it is acceptable to all after a thorough deliberation and mutual understanding of one another's particular points of view, then that's good enough for the time being. That's always revisable, because it may well be that in the light of further experience and in the light of further perspectives that have been developed, that consensus may break down. It's a weak consensus. It's not that everybody agrees on the best option. It's that they agree on something they think everybody can accept. And we just keep going that way. This is terribly pragmatist all the way through. So everything is revisable, but at each stage, what we try to do is to find something acceptable to all.
Thank you. I think that is a good answer. There's another question by Joanna Chafone. She writes, I appreciate the focus on conversations, but what is the role of passionate emotions, such as anger, in ensuring moral progress? And then she adds, I'm thinking of Misha Cherry's new book, The Case for Rage, in which she defends a certain kind of anger as necessary for racist struggle.
This is actually the question that dominated the comments that I received when I gave the lectures in Munich. It's a question about, without struggle, we get nowhere. And of course, that's historically true. It's been the case throughout the history of the examples that I employ. It's been the case through any number of other examples as well, that there has along the way been violence, bloodshed, people suffering. The Deweyan hope is you can do better than that you can actually diminish the amount of suffering, and you can diminish the risk that things will go badly wrong. So I guess I want to respond to that by offering, a very simple kind of analogy. So go back to John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, where he talks about the ways in which legal systems came into being. He says, look, people used to think of justice as something that was settled by trial, by violence, by the number of allies you could recruit and get on your side to win the struggle. But going to the processes of the law was an advance upon that. Now, I regard what I'm saying in a similar fashion. I don't think anger. I think anger temporarily can do good, but I think when it comes to actually trying to settle things, the anger has to be muted. The points have to be made, and one has to listen. One has to try to understand. And after one understands, one may still be angry. It's still quite possible that one will end up being angry, but then the deliberation has failed. The point of the deliberation is to get beyond that, to understanding points of view and to changing points of view in light of that understanding. So if you like, you can think of me as somebody who's really trying to get beyond the chanciness, the bloodshed, the suffering that have, I think basically been large parts of the career of human moral progress. And I regard my commentators as saying, you just can't do better than that. And they might be right. It might be impossible. But I'd like to think we could give it a good try to see if we can do better than that. Can we do something better for fellow citizenship, for fellow humanity, to make ourselves feel greater solidarity with one another? I mean, who knows how far we can get in that direction? And at the end, there may always have to be rage. But I hope we can continue to diminish the amount of rage that we need. Just as Locke thought we could get rid of frontier justice. And, we don't have a perfect legal system by any means, I think, in any country, but especially not in the United States. But, it's better than frontier justice.
Thank you. There is another question about the extent to which your idea of the ideal conversation has been influenced by Habermas.
Okay. This is. Look. The funny thing is that I am getting closer and closer and closer to some of Habermas's philosophical descendants, to Axel Honneth, who's now my Columbia colleague, been my Columbia colleague for some time, and especially to Rahel Yegi. So there's a kind of sequence from Habermas to Axel to Rahel, and I think there's a kind of convergence there. And what I see Axel and Rahel doing as rejecting Habermas, these kinds of ideal elements, the stuff about the conditions of the speech situation, the idea of some kind of Kantian a priori working in the background. And I gotta say, I think that's a mistake on Habermas's part. I think he's too much, as it were, removed from the nitty-gritty of ethical and political and life and the decision making. And there's something too abstract about his formulations. But in a certain sense, you can see in Habermas some of the features that I want to emphasize. So Habermas is closer to me than, say, Rawls is. And Honneth is closer to me than Habermas is. Rahel Yegi is closer to me than Axel Honneth is, and so it goes. So there's, there is a convergence between my approach to this and a tradition in critical theory. That is absolutely clear.
Thank you. Then there is a question by Carsten Struhl. He writes, within the dialogue between certain perspectives, attention to information, etc., are there certain overarching values which inform what we can take as moral progress? For example, reducing suffering, increasing human freedom, human flourishing, and so forth.
There are what the participants in the conversation think of as important. And those will probably include the absence of suffering. They will probably include human flourishing. But how the concepts of suffering and of flourishing are worked out in practice will probably vary depending on the historical age, the kind of problem that's being dealt with, and the people whose perspectives are in question. So, I mean, I think in a certain sense, somebody might be able to say at the end of moral life, possibly the end of human extinction, throughout it all, there were these things on which people agreed. There were these kinds of universal things that were valued. Well, I don't think we can guess what those are before the end. And so we need the working out of this. There's a sense in which I hear the question as saying, can't we sort of resurrect a kind of discovery view here? And the answer is possibly at the end of time, we could work out a version of that. We could say, these are the things that guided the conversation, and these are the things that the people discovered as they went. But I think, while we're in the thick of it, we don't know what that looks like. And so that's why I emphasize the process and its open-endedness, because I do think that the process could come out in many different places. I don't think it's completely open, because I think there are certain kinds of things that would always, in human life, give rise to problems. So I think it might be the case that rather than universal values, there might be certain kinds of universal disvalues. But that's a bit different from saying that there are universal values that guide the conversation. It's a very subtle and interesting question. And I've said a few things about this in the book, but I'm hoping to be able to give a more adequate treatment of it in some future work, which I'm currently engaged on. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, we're looking forward to reading that then. There's another question which is slightly longer. I tried to condense it. It's by Sean Mavundla. He starts looking at how morality informed by religiosity in many instances weaponizes the law in order to perpetuate gross violation of human rights in relation to same-sex relationships. Then he gives the example of Ghana, that has proposed an extreme anti-gay pill that seeks to punish gays. So legally, people can hold such beliefs that being gay is immoral, but how can we persuade such people that criminalizing same-sex relationships is not only a violation of people's rights, but also tramples on their dignity? So
the book distinguishes between two kinds of problems that beset moral progress. On the one hand, there's the problem of basically deafness. You just don't listen to certain kinds of people when they try to express their suffering, which is what I think is going on in Ghana. But there's another problem, which is when the people who are themselves are, allied with the sufferers, there are members of the same group who don't complain, then it's very easy to block the complaints by saying, well, look, normal people really don't want that sort of thing. So this was often said of women when they campaigned for greater opportunities. No, 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 no. There are all these women who are perfectly contented with their lot in life. You're just troublemakers. You're blue stockings. You're half women. You're monstrous. And that was actually, I think, true to some extent also in the same-sex case, that there were some people who were convinced that these urges were sinful because that's what they were told time and time again. So there's an issue of false consciousness, and there's also an issue of not being listened to. And you have to tackle both of those problems in tandem, it seems to me. So you need ways of trying to bring to light the fact that a certain kind of marginalization, a certain kind of limitation needs to be questioned. And then you need to have a serious discussion among the religious or between the religious and those who can complain about their suffering. Now, you can't, in this conversation, in this kind of conversation, you cannot really allow a certain kind of religious conversation, which is the kind of conversation stopping kind. That's the antithesis of open-mindedness. So the religious person can put forward a thesis, but cannot say, and because this is the word of the Almighty, it takes precedence over everything else. Again, this is something that I've tried to write about and tried to explain what the role of religion might be and where it oversteps that role. So what I want to say about the Ghanaians is, so long as there is an option of declaring on religious grounds that certain kinds of things are the last word, there's nothing more to be said, that's an obstacle to moral progress. Just as it would be if it were, Stalin's utterance is the last word on moral progress. It doesn't have to be religious, it can be secular as well. But the point about the ideal of deliberation that I put forward is that cannot be. You cannot simply assert something on the basis of a supposedly authoritative text. So, I don't know how you do this practically. I suspect it will take long years to overthrow that kind of attitude in the places in the world where it still flourishes. But it's terribly important, I think, to get beyond that.